Ella estaba en el centro de la sala, y a su alrededor reinaba el pánico. Los traductores guardaban silencio. La gerente gritaba. La rica invitada coreana no respondía hasta que intervino una anciana limpiadora. Ella habló en coreano y destruyó todo lo que parecía inquebrantable. Suscríbete y escribe en los comentarios desde qué ciudad nos ves. The morning bustle of the Regal Crown Hotel in downtown Chicago moved with practiced elegance. Crisp uniforms glided across marble floors, wheeled luggage whispered over polished tiles, and the air was filled with a polite murmur of international accents. Behind the gleaming front desk, the staff greeted each guest with synchronized nods and smiles, eyes alert yet distant. Everything ran like a luxury machine, discreet, controlled, expensive. Somewhere in the far corner of the vast lobby, where the morning sunlight filtered through glass-paneled walls, Matilda Harris wiped a damp cloth along the edges of a decorative planter. Her gray curls peeked beneath her hotel-issued headscarf, and her worn shoes whispered quietly over the floor she had scrubbed for 6 years. She moved slowly, with the caution of someone who had learned to make herself invisible. She had learned early that eyes slid past her easily, that voices dropped or changed when they noticed she was nearby. And so Matilda had become a ghost in her own workplace, a silent keeper of secrets and stains, both literal and figurative. The day was like any other until the lobby doors opened with a soft chime and a small entourage entered the space with the composed precision of people used to making decisions that affected millions. At the center of the group was a woman in a tailored cream suit, calm, still, and unmistakably powerful. Her presence seemed to slow the air around her. A man in his 30s hovered just behind her, holding a tablet and phone in each hand, his eyes flicking between their screens and her face for cues. Behind them, a pair of men in dark suits stood like silent shadows. Matilda noticed the subtle details that others missed. The way the woman's fingers were clasped lightly but firmly, the slight curve in her posture that suggested fatigue, and most importantly, the quiet urgency in her eyes. This woman, whoever she was not here for leisure. She was here on business, and it was important. The front desk staff straightened instantly. Smiles widened, voices rose half a pitch in their rehearsed cheerfulness. The guests were greeted and offered assistance in English, then Mandarin, then Japanese, then Thai. Each attempt was met with silence. The woman, calm and inscrutable, simply tilted her head. Her assistant said something softly in Korean and glanced at the concierge, but his words went unrecognized. Within minutes, the front desk had summoned their top interpreters, 3 of them, dressed in sleek suits, each specializing in different Asian languages. They approached confidently, exchanging polite greetings, but confusion crept quickly into their expressions as they began speaking. They cycled through dialects, repeated phrases, and finally resorted to English with hopeful gestures. Still nothing. Matilda moved her cleaning cart behind a marble pillar and watched. Her heart began to stir with a faint but familiar sense of unease. She had seen this before. The confusion, the mounting frustration, the quiet condescension behind fake smiles. She had learned to read the air in a room the way others read fine print. Something was wrong. It wasn't that the woman couldn't understand. It was that she was waiting. Across the lobby, Vivian Larson emerged from the executive hallway like a queen summoned to restore order. Tall, blonde, and deliberate in every movement, Vivian had built her career in hospitality on a combination of charm and iron will. She approached the scene with the air of someone who believed every problem had a simple solution, provided she was the one solving it. "What seems to be the issue?" she asked the head receptionist, who explained quickly. Vivian turned toward the woman with a gracious smile and spoke slowly, firmly, in textbook English. When there was no response, she repeated herself, louder this time. Still nothing. Behind her, the interpreters looked defeated. One shook his head. "It's not Mandarin, not Japanese, not Thai. Possibly Korean, but it's a dialect I don't recognize," he said. Matilda saw the way Vivian's mouth thinned. That was the beginning of the turn, the moment when politeness curdled into irritation. She had seen it happen dozens of times before, in conference rooms, hotel hallways, in staff briefings. What began as cheerful professionalism always had a breaking point, and once it passed, what was left wasn't always pretty. The woman still said nothing. She stood at the center of the chaos like a statue carved from stillness, her expression unreadable. But Matilda caught it, the tightening around her eyes, the barely perceptible shift in her jaw. She wasn't confused. She was insulted, and she was waiting to see how far they would go. Vivian's tone shifted. "This is turning into a scene," she murmured, eyes darting around the lobby. "Someone get Mr. Hernandez from guest services. This is becoming an embarrassment." Matilda's hands moved instinct. The morning at the Regal Crown Hotel unfurled like a well-rehearsed symphony, every player knowing their part. Uniformed staff moved efficiently across the grand marble lobby, their polished shoes gliding over pristine tiles that reflected the soft gold of chandeliers above. The scent of fresh lilies mingled with the gentle aroma of imported coffee wafting from the adjacent cafe. And behind the sleek reception desk, young professionals greeted guests with mechanical warmth. In the corners, nearly invisible, maintenance staff moved like shadows, ensuring the grandeur remained untouched. Among them was Matilda Harris. At 70, Matilda carried herself with quiet precision. Her gray curls were tucked neatly under a navy blue scarf, her frame lean but still upright, and her hands, though worn by years of labor, moved with graceful efficiency. She had been scrubbing, wiping, polishing, and sweeping for 6 long years in this very lobby. And in all that time she had learned the art of being unseen. No one looked twice at the woman with the mop. She had become part of the furniture like the ornate vases or the antique grandfather clock by the elevators. Guests would smile past her, conversations would fall silent as she passed, and managers would speak around her as though she were not there. Matilda did not resent this. She had learned long ago that invisibility was both a burden and a shield. It let her listen, observe, and remember. That morning, as she polished the brass frame of a large floor-to-ceiling mirror, the revolving glass doors at the entrance turned slowly. A subtle hush fell over the front desk as a woman stepped into the lobby. She was elegant, poised, dressed in a pale cream suit with clean lines that whispered wealth rather than screamed it. Her face was calm, her movements deliberate, and she was accompanied by a younger man holding 2 phones and a leather-bound notebook. Behind them, 2 silent bodyguards followed, their eyes scanning the room. The receptionist, a young man named Julian, straightened his tie and stepped forward. He welcomed the guest in English, smiling with bright enthusiasm. She didn't respond. He tried again, slower this time, enunciating each word. The woman blinked but said nothing. Her assistant stepped forward and muttered something to Julian, who furrowed his brow in confusion. The concierge was called over. He tried Mandarin, then Japanese, then Thai, but the woman merely nodded politely and remained silent. Matilda paused mid-polish. She recognized the moment when politeness began to fray. The young man assisting the woman seemed increasingly tense. He whispered to her, and she replied softly in a language that wasn't recognized by anyone present. The concierge made a call, and within minutes, 3 interpreters in dark suits arrived, each confident, professional, and prepared. They introduced themselves, tried greeting the woman in various dialects, Korean, Cantonese, Tagalog, but nothing stuck. The woman remained serene, dignified, and maddeningly unresponsive. Her assistant grew more restless, glancing at his phone repeatedly, likely checking meeting times and hotel arrangements that now hung in limbo. Matilda watched from behind a column, gripping the handle of her cart. She studied the woman closely. There was no confusion in her eyes, no fear, only observation. She wasn't lost. She was waiting, and that simple truth settled heavily in Matilda's chest. The tension in the room rippled as the front desk whispered among themselves. And then, like a storm cloud rolling in from a distant sky, Vivian Larson arrived. Vivian was everything a luxury hotel manager was supposed to be. Sharp, attractive, and relentless. She walked with a confidence that bordered on theatrical, her heels clacking authoritatively across the floor Matilda had just cleaned. Her blazer was crisp, her blonde bob flawless, and her smile tight. She approached the cluster of interpreters and staff and asked, in a voice meant to carry, what the problem was. The concierge quickly explained. Vivian turned toward the silent guest and launched into a smooth, rehearsed greeting in English. No response. She tried again, louder this time with the false cheer of someone talking to a slow child. Still nothing. Vivian's smile tightened. She waved over one of the interpreters and asked for a summary. The man, clearly frustrated, said he had exhausted all the most common Asian languages. He speculated that it might be a regional dialect of Korean, but nothing had worked so far. Matilda turned back to her cart, pretending to sort through cleaning supplies. But her ears stayed open. The manager's voice rose slightly and her words sharpened. "This is unacceptable," Vivian muttered. Then more loudly, "We can't spend the entire morning playing charades with a guest who refuses to cooperate. Someone get Mr. Hernandez from guest services. This needs to be resolved before the other VIPs arrive." Matilda flinched. The word "refuses" echoed too loudly in the vast lobby. She looked at the woman again, calm, steady, silent. But there it was, the subtle clench of her jaw, the smallest twitch in her right hand. She was furious, and yet she stood still, letting them misinterpret her silence as confusion. Vivian turned to the concierge. "If this isn't resolved in 15 minutes, I'm canceling her reservation. We can't risk our reputation on someone who won't engage." From where she stood, Matilda could see the assistant typing rapidly on his phone, likely rearranging meetings or canceling accommodations. She knew the rhythm of chaos, the language of stress, even when spoken in silence. And this woman, whoever she was, held power. That much was clear. Matilda also noticed something no one else did. The way the guest's eyes flicked toward the commotion, the subtle disdain in the lift of her chin when Vivian spoke louder. She understood English. She had understood from the very beginning, but she had chosen not to respond. Vivian, now flustered, turned to the growing number of onlookers in the lobby. "Look at this," she said to no one in particular, gesturing toward the guest. "We have a presidential suite reserved for a woman who can't even ask for a towel. This is a 5-star American hotel. If you can't speak the language, you have no business booking our premium services." The words hung in the air like smoke. A few guests looked away. One older man raised an eyebrow. A couple standing near the entrance shook their heads. Matilda felt the familiar burn in her chest. She had felt it many times before, when her opinions were dismissed, when a guest shoved a towel into her hands without a glance, when a manager corrected her English, not knowing she had once taught it overseas. Vivian's voice kept rising. The interpreters looked increasingly uncomfortable. The assistant's fingers danced furiously across his screen, and still the guest said nothing. Matilda took a deep breath. She closed the lid of her cleaning cart. The brass she had been polishing gleamed in the light, but it no longer mattered. Her eyes were fixed on the woman in the cream suit, and something inside her, a quiet, long-buried thing, began to rise. Not today, she thought. The lobby was no longer just a lobby, it was a stage. And on that stage, a performance of arrogance and ignorance was unfolding in real time. Matilda had seen enough. She knew what the next chapter in this story would be if no one stopped it. Her grip tightened on the edge of the cart. Let them keep talking. She was almost ready. Matilda stood perfectly still behind her cleaning cart, watching the scene unravel before her with the kind of slow-motion clarity that only years of silent observation could provide. The lobby, once an elegant sanctuary of order and efficiency, now buzzed with the low hum of tension, embarrassment, and gathering scandal. She had seen many things in her decades of working rudeness disguised as policy, cruelty masked as efficiency. But this morning had begun to feel different. It had passed a line. Vivian Larson's voice carried across the room like a bell with a crack in it, sharp and jarring. She was no longer trying to hide her irritation. Her tone had moved past diplomacy and now dripped with open disdain. She gestured toward the silent woman in the cream suit, still standing calmly at the center of the growing commotion. Her words became more theatrical, pointed at the onlookers as if rallying them to her side, as if the guest's refusal to speak were some kind of insult to the entire establishment, to her authority. Matilda had scrubbed the same section of marble floor just hours earlier, had buffed the veins in the stone until her arms ached, and now those tiles were bearing witness to a kind of humiliation she knew all too well. She had stood silently by while guests yelled, while managers dismissed her, while colleagues rolled their eyes at her suggestions or ideas. She had told herself it wasn't worth it, that invisibility was a form of peace, that speaking up was a risk reserved for those who had something left to lose. But something about the way the guest's fingers curled ever so slightly at her side made Matilda think of her younger self. Of the day she stood frozen outside a conference room where a Latina colleague, Maria, with tired eyes and perfect Spanish, had been scolded in front of executives for mispronouncing an English phrase. Matilda had stepped forward then, quietly offered to translate, only to be dismissed, told to return to her zone and let the professionals handle it. Maria was fired the next day. Matilda had cried in her car, ashamed of how little she had done. Today felt like a mirror to that day, but this time, something in her spirit refused to shrink. Vivian turned back toward the silent guest, her hands slicing the air in frustration. "If she can't communicate, she doesn't belong in this establishment," she snapped. There was a pause in the room, a moment of stillness before something broke. The assistant looked at his employer with a quiet urgency. He said something in Korean, gesturing toward the exit. She replied calmly, her gaze resting once again on the manager, then on the staff behind her, then on the watching crowd. The message was clear. They were ready to leave. Matilda recognized that moment, the one right before someone walks out, not because they are lost, but because they are done. The woman in cream lifted her chin slightly, and Matilda felt something shift inside her. It wasn't just passive indignation anymore. It was the slow ignition of long-held frustration, of countless slights and layered injustices. It was the memory of fluorescent lights above dull office ceilings, where her qualifications were ignored, her experience undervalued. It was the countless times she had translated for immigrants in community centers, had listened with care and empathy to their fears, had studied cultural nuance so she could help others find their footing in a new world. It was all of that, bubbling now behind her ribs. She turned her head slightly and caught the guest's gaze. It was only for an instant, but it felt like a conversation. Something passed between them, a mutual recognition, a quiet acknowledgement that they both knew exactly what was happening here, that neither was surprised and that neither would forget. Vivian clapped her hands, signaling for someone to bring security. "We can't allow this to continue," she declared, now talking more to the room than to the guest herself. "We have protocols, standards. We can't just let anyone come in here and—" That was it. Matilda removed her gloves with slow, deliberate movements. She set them neatly on her cart beside the folded towel. Her fingers trembled, but not from fear. It was energy, a current of something deeper, something inevitable. She smoothed the front of her uniform, straightened her shoulders, and stepped forward. The crowd parted. It didn't matter that she was wearing a faded Navy housekeeping uniform, that her name tag read Matilda in tiny print, or that her shoes squeaked faintly against the tile. When she walked, people moved. Her presence commanded space not with force, but with certainty. Vivian turned, startled. "Excuse me," she said sharply. "Return to your station. This doesn't concern you." But Matilda didn't even glance at her. Her eyes were fixed on the woman in cream. She stopped just a few feet away and bowed her head slightly. And then, with a clarity that sliced through the room like a blade, she spoke in Korean. The room went silent. The guest blinked. Her lips parted slightly. She responded softly, then with increasing warmth. Matilda replied in kind, her posture relaxed, her voice flowing with the ease of someone who had spent years shaping each word with respect. The translator stood frozen. Vivian looked stunned, as if the floor beneath her had tilted. The assistant stared openly. Matilda continued speaking, her sentences melodic, her tone gentle but assured. She gestured lightly, explaining, inviting. The woman listened, nodding. Her shoulders loosened. The tension that had gripped her so tightly began to dissolve. Vivian took a step forward. "What is going on? What are you saying?" Matilda turned then, not to answer, but to signal the end of the conversation. The guest placed a hand over her heart, a gesture of thanks, and bowed her head in respect. Matilda mirrored it, then she turned fully to face Vivian. Her expression was calm, her voice measured. "What should have happened," she said, "has happened." Vivian sputtered, looking around for support, but none came. Even the concierge, who had stood loyally beside her for years, remained silent. The guest's assistant stepped forward now and addressed the desk in flawless English. "We will remain. Ms. Park would like to proceed with the check-in." Vivian's jaw dropped. "She speaks English?" Matilda didn't flinch. The guest looked at Vivian and replied herself in precise, elegant English, fluently. There was a beat of stunned silence, a few gasps. Someone coughed awkwardly. A woman near the elevators took a step back, eyes wide. "I understood everything," the guest continued, her voice low but resolute. "Every insult, every assumption." Vivian opened her mouth, then closed it. Her face turned pale. For the first time in a very long time, she had nothing to say. Matilda remained where she was, standing tall. She felt no triumph, no glee, only the deep, quiet peace that comes when something finally falls into place. In the background, someone cleared their throat. A bellhop shifted uncomfortably. The energy in the room had changed. Something had been revealed, and it could not be undone. Matilda turned back toward her cart. Her gloves were still there, resting beside the towel, exactly where she had left them. But she would not need them again, not today. The lobby of the Regal Crown stood frozen in a rare and vulnerable stillness. The echo of Matilda's Korean words still lingered in the air, like the last note of a long-held piano chord. Staff members who had moments earlier bustled confidently now hovered in silence, and guests who had come and gone unnoticed for hours were suddenly standing still, watching as if the ornate floor beneath their shoes had turned into a stage. All eyes were fixed on the woman in the cream suit and the elderly housekeeper who had, with nothing but quiet authority and perfect articulation, shattered the illusion of control held by the hotel's management. Vivian Larson stood rooted in place. Her mouth opened, then closed again. Her gaze flicked from Matilda to the guest Ms. Park, as they now knew, and then to the assistant, whose expression had transformed from anxious to sharply alert. The young man adjusted his tie, stepped forward, and confirmed in polished English that they would indeed be staying at the Regal Crown. All necessary meetings were being adjusted, he explained. There had simply been a miscommunication, one that had now been resolved. Vivian tried to respond, but her voice came out strained. "She speaks English?" Matilda didn't answer, and she didn't need to. Ms. Park took a calm step forward and turned her full attention to the manager. Her eyes, no longer unreadable, carried the weight of carefully controlled disdain. "I have spoken English fluently since the age of 12, she said evenly, her accent refined but unmistakably Korean. "I attended university in London, completed my MBA in New York, and oversee international operations across 5 continents. I chose not to respond in English because I was waiting to see how you would behave when faced with difference." Gasps rippled through the lobby. No one moved. Vivian's face flushed crimson. "You stood here," Miss Park continued, her voice steady, "and humiliated your own staff, disrespected your guest, and mocked my culture, all while assuming ignorance where there was none." Vivian attempted to speak, but Ms. Park raised a hand with precise grace. "And the only person in this room who treated me with dignity," she said, turning her gaze back to Matilda, "was someone you yourself dismissed as unworthy of having a voice." For a long moment, no one breathed. Then Matilda, still standing tall in her uniform, bowed her head slightly. It wasn't out of submission, but respect, a quiet gesture shared between 2 women who had recognized something in each other that no one else had. The assistant stepped beside his employer. "Ms. Park would like to ensure that the remainder of her stay is handled discreetly and respectfully. We will proceed to the suite now." Before Vivian could say a word, the concierge, who had stood to the side this entire time with a furrowed brow and nervous fingers, nodded quickly and motioned for a bellhop to assist. As the entourage moved toward the elevators, murmurs began to buzz in their wake. Phones were subtly pulled from pockets. Texts were sent. The moment had spread like ink in water, and there was no gathering it back. Vivian turned sharply toward Matilda. Her voice was low, furious, but brittle. "You had no authority to speak, no training, no clearance. You're a cleaning lady." Matilda regarded her with a look that was neither angry nor apologetic. "And yet I was the only one who listened," she said simply. Vivian opened her mouth, but the concierge stepped forward before she could reply. He cleared his throat and spoke with a formality that was both careful and deliberate. "Ms. Larson, perhaps it would be wise to allow the guest to settle into her suite before further engagement. The incident appears to be resolved." Vivian blinked in disbelief. "Resolved?" Her voice pitched upward. "This is a PR disaster, a scandal." "Then perhaps we should be grateful someone was able to resolve it," the concierge said, not unkindly, but with unmistakable firmness. Matilda didn't wait for another word. She stepped back from the confrontation and walked slowly toward her cart. The room had not changed, and yet everything in it had. People were no longer looking through her. Their eyes followed her movements, not with suspicion or irritation, but with a dawning awareness that they had never truly seen her before. She was halfway to the service hallway when she heard her name. "Ms. Harris?" She turned to find Marcus, the senior concierge, one of the few staff members she had quietly respected. A man who always nodded when he passed, who never raised his voice, who once slipped her a thank you card on Christmas Day, signed only with a simple M. He stood now with his hands clasped, his voice low and careful. "I just wanted to say," he began, "what you did today. It mattered. Thank you." She gave him a small nod, her throat too tight to answer. She turned away and pushed her cart toward the elevator that led to the staff quarters. Hours passed. The buzz of the incident continued to spread behind closed doors, through encrypted messages, over staff radios and private WhatsApp chats. But Matilda kept to her rhythm. She finished cleaning the storage closet, updated her inventory sheets, and returned all borrowed supplies. She performed each task with a practiced serenity, knowing without needing confirmation that the shape of her life had changed. By mid-afternoon, she was summoned to the Human Resources office. Vivian was waiting inside, arms crossed, jaw tight. A representative from corporate was on a video call, and another from the Regional Hospitality Board sat with a legal pad, taking notes. They cited protocol violations, overstepping, lack of chain of command. Vivian requested immediate suspension pending investigation. Matilda listened without flinching. When asked if she had anything to say in her defense, she replied only, "My only concern was for the dignity of a guest who was being mistreated. If that is against protocol, then so be it." They handed her a formal notice. She accepted it. And as she left the office, she felt no fear, only clarity. That evening, in a penthouse suite overlooking the city skyline, Ms. Park sat at her desk, her assistant beside her. A laptop glowed in front of them, the screen displaying a detailed professional profile. Matilda Harris's resume, volunteer history, and academic background. "She taught English in Seoul for 5 years, the assistant said, scrolling. "Fluent in Korean, Spanish, and French. Certified interpreter. Former outreach coordinator for a Chicago community center." "Ms. Park tapped her manicured nails thoughtfully against the desk. "Send her an invitation," she said. "We need someone to lead our intercultural operations team here in the States, and I want her." Down on the west side of the city, Matilda returned home to a modest apartment filled with books, framed photos, and quiet. She hung her uniform on the hook behind the door. Her hands still smelled faintly of lemon polish and floor wax. She sat at the small table in her kitchen, opened the envelope from HR, and placed it beside her. She did not cry. She did not rage. She simply waited. The next morning, the email arrived. The subject line was short, "Opportunity," and it was signed by a name she would never forget. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a new video. Watch our other powerful stories about justice, dignity, and second chances. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that true worth is never invisible.